we can measure this. We can all figure out, we can measure it. And we can price it. I mean, all of those things are achievable. What I'm not sure we can do, not like you maybe all to comment on a little bit, is find the political willpower and the sort of define the economic reality as to how we're going to make this transition. I've had the pleasure in serving on this committee now of being either flying over or being in these forests in the Philippines, in Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Indonesia, over the Amazon. And it's shocking. I mean, 5 and 10 years ago, the level of clear cutting that I saw flying over that Laotian triple canopy as illegal logging was taking place. I mean, the enforcement piece of this has not been talked about. And that is perhaps one of the most significant pieces of this. I was just recently in Indonesia when I was in Bali. I met with the Indonesian ministers on this. And they sort of look at you with a wink and a nod and a smile, but the fact is everybody knows what's happening under the table and around the corner. The pressures economically to do otherwise here are just going to be gigantic. The Time magazine a couple of weeks ago had a superb photograph that showed the Amazonian deforestation, and you just see miles upon miles of lush green soybean growing, and this one little patch left of triple canopy that just, it makes you cry when you look at what's happening. I saw the latest satellite shots, and you look down on the level of deforestation, the percentage is just enormous and growing. Ambassador Eisenstein is absolutely correct about the time imperative here. And the economic pressures just grow. To take a nation, I mean, I've had these arguments with some of the Brazilians who it's cattle ranching and soybean that is pressuring most of that deforestation there. You have to provide an alternative. I mean, the economic realities in most of these countries are these politicians are not going to enforce something that is denuding them of their base. And if those folks don't have an alternative job and place to earn a living, this is all pie in the sky talk. None of that component is adequately being addressed as we talk about even putting the credits in place. Because you can put the credits in place and you can have your market out there and you can be trading in this. Meanwhile, right underneath of that, all of this illicit trade is going to take place because the economics push it so imperatively. So we have to get an enforcement mechanism in place that goes with the measuring and the transparency. And these countries are going to have to sign up and be part of this because we can't go in there and enforce for them, obviously. So there's a huge task to accomplish. 85% of Indonesia's greenhouse gases come from deforestation now. And they're in the top 20 of the world's countries contributing as a result of deforestation.
The top 5.
Top 5. And particularly in the last year or two, there's been massive, I mean, as you fly over it, you see these massive burns taking place and so forth, all of which contributes to the global warming, climate change. So I'd like you to just sort of address that. I mean, I know we can measure, I know we can price, I know we can put in place a trading mechanism. The question is, can we get these countries to sign on, and what will be the economic reality of the transformation of their economies so they don't have a revolution, so they don't lose their governing capacity and everybody else says, the hell with you, we're going in and taking out the forest because that's what we have to do to survive. I'd like you to address that. Ambassador?
I could just start. First of all, the fact that we had a treaty was significantly due to the fact that Senator Kerry was there. He was a virtual part of our negotiating team, and without his day and night support and lobbying of the EU, we would never have gotten a treaty. I think that the political will is there, and I cite 2 examples. One, which I mentioned in my testimony, and that is the some 15 to 17 countries in the Rainforest Coalition of nations who are saying to the world and said at Bali, provide us incentives, and our contribution will be to take specific commitments not to cut our forests down. Now, is that perfect? Of course it's not. But neither are any other
have to
commitment.
go beyond the fund and the credit.
Absolutely. What they're saying is give us incentives, and this is our contribution. Now, we've been looking, I mean, you know, at Kyoto, and Mr. Chairman, the terrible problem we had, we had two major problems. One was dealing with the EU, which wanted to exact as much pain and suffering on their companies as they could without offsets, sinks, and so forth. I mean, I was ambassador to the EU, and that's another story. But the second problem was China and India had a chokehold on countries like Argentina and others who wanted to take commitments. They wouldn't allow it. It was written into Kyoto. Now we've got a group of countries who are saying, look, we're not going to take economy-wide emission. It doesn't make sense for these Papua New Guinea and countries like that to do it. But our contribution, just exactly what you said in your really brilliant opening statement about the fact that every country has an obligation, but some have different obligations depending on their level of industrialization. They're saying our obligation, our commitment, our participation will be not to cut our forests down if you provide those incentives. And they have the political will. They formed a coalition, and they're lobbying for this. In addition, Brazil is in fact beginning to change its policy. People mentioned the New York Times story on Sunday. The flip side of that, the positive side is, for goodness sakes, they're now committing resources to stop the logging, to stop the cutting. I mean, yes, there is leakage and there are problems, but the fact is they're now taking steps themselves to make sure that those soybeans that you saw don't grow. And if we don't provide them incentives to do that, then we're going to find that the pressures from farmers and others will be overwhelming.
Well, I think it's well said. One hopes it will happen, but do you see a sufficient level of global leadership within the developed countries to try to put those incentives on the table?
Well, I think that's why it has to start with our legislation. In June, this is going to be debated. And the best way, Senator Kerry, for us to show we're serious in a forest issue is for someone, either the chairman's mark with Lieberman Warner or one of you on this committee, to introduce in the 15% allowance that the bill permits for international trading, to specifically say that forestry credits are permitted as part of that 15%. That will send a signal to these developing countries. It's the single most important thing that could be done when this comes up for debate.
I agree completely. I'm sure we'll either try to get it in the mark, or I'm sure Senator Menendez and I will work to try and do it. Did you want to comment, Mr. Forster?
Just to say that I guess in a way stating the obvious, that you're right that the Europeans have up until this point not had a great appetite for forestry-related products coming into their market. But I do think as they look toward the increased level of stringency going out into the future and the potential demand from the United States and Japan and other countries as they ratchet down further on their commitments, that additional tools are needed in the market. And providing I do think providing the incentive from the financial side that there's a pull on these types of credits, there's value in keeping your forest standing, that it does tend to create an alliance with the landowner to try to protect that forest and keep it standing, because otherwise they don't get the reward of the money for the forestry offset. So I do think that fundamental design element is sort of what's core to it. There does need to be enforcement locally, but that's a very important component of it. But at the same time, they just don't get their money. They don't get their value unless the forest continues to produce the carbon benefit.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Mr. Hayes?
Just wanted to make one related point, Senator. Your point is very well taken in terms of the local politics needing to work for these countries, and I think it's important to put sustainable forestry into this mix here. I don't think we can have a situation where you simply have large cash payments going to countries that are avoiding deforestation and think that that's going to change the economic drivers here. There are tremendous advances that are being made in terms of sustainable forestry, of keeping forests that are producing forest products, that are sequestering carbon in those products, that are protecting canopies with those products, and that's another place where the U.S. can lead through amending the Lacey Act, for example, and requiring that there not be products coming into the U.S. that are illegal, and more importantly, probably putting a forward push on demand by asking for certification of that products are coming from sustainable forest, from forests that meet sustainable standards. I think these practical on-the-ground things are extremely important.
To accomplish, my time is up, but to accomplish all of these things, folks, I think you will agree, you really have to have a robust, international, transparent, accountable enforcement mechanism. And those countries are going to have to sign up to that line. And I still don't see an adequacy there, but I think we're moving in the right direction. You give it enough economic value without allowances that are just giveaways for bad practices or that encourage leakage, et cetera. You've got to have a comprehensive piece here. But if we do that, and I think it is doable, then hopefully we can encourage a sufficiently robust effort on the enforcement piece. But you know, it's like, I mean, I was chairman of the Fisheries Subcommittee on Commerce for 10 years, 15 years or something. And we've been struggling with saying, you know, too much money chasing too few fish. And we don't have enough monitors. We don't have people out there, you know, who are enforcing across the board. And I think the same thing will be true in this sector as the demand for those hardwoods, for the, you know, mahogany and the teak and this and that, the other thing. You're going to have tough enforcement.
Dr. Gurney, I saw you inching there. So
just a very quick comment, just to emphasize that there is obviously a linkage between the financial incentive and the mechanisms those take and the magnitudes and this monitoring measurement question. Just to go back to previous comment, again, some of the largest sources of uncertainty are in fact the in-country capacity, technical capacity, human capacity, infrastructure. That's actually where probably the biggest difficulty is faced from the scientific point of view. So certainly, again, there's a linkage between, with a sufficient price signal, there's a coevolution between the ability to improve measuring and monitoring and the power and strength of that price signal. And so it's important to recognize that the two will most likely co-evolve, since the weakest part is in fact probably the in-country technical capacity component.
So clearly there'd be an incentive for the greater the ability for the evaluation to take place, the greater the value that may rise in terms of the credit.
And I think what I would say to supplement what the professor was actually certainly true about the capacity. You have to have both satellite capacity above and you have to have the in-country capacity on the ground. The in-country capacity in countries like Brazil is improving. It's not where it needs to be, but my point is twofold. Number one, while we're building that capacity, let's put the legislation in effect. And number two, there are mechanisms. The World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership Facility is trying to provide assistance for just that purpose. The Norwegians just announced an aid package for forests. We could do the same. So we need to build that capacity on the ground. There are mechanisms to already do that. And by the time the legislation passes the Senate and gets implemented, we will be much further along, not with just the satellite telemetry, but with on-the-ground capacity building in the countries themselves.
Let me follow up, thank Senator Kerry for his intervention. Let me follow up with two last questions and then we'll let you go. One is along the lines of something I thought Senator Kerry was mentioning. I wanted to pursue it in my second round, and that is the whole sustainable development aspect of this, insofar as that, just like when we were dealing with Plan Colombia in a different context, you know, one thing was to do the enforcement, but if you don't give a poor coca farmer an alternative to sustain his family, he's going to continue to grow coca, and that's not in our interest. Similarly, here there are obviously consequences as well. Logging is not necessarily the only action that is being taken here, and the question is, as part of the inducement, should part of the inducement be how we create sustainable development alternatives, create incentives towards sustainable development in these countries that have the rainforests?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with what David said. I think we should strengthen the Conservation Act, the Leahy Amendment, exactly as David said. We ought to make it increasingly difficult to import logs from countries that don't have sustainable development programs, and the kind of certification program, I think, which David mentioned, makes all sorts of sense. So this has to be attacked from a variety of ways. We need ODA for funds. We need a carbon market to include forestry credits. We need sustainable development programs. All of these together have to be considered as part of a whole.
So, as the subcommittee, which also holds jurisdiction over all of our foreign assistance, it seems to me that one of the marriages we want to be looking at here, particularly as it relates to these countries, is what are we doing in these countries in terms of USAID and other related development assistance projects to marry some of that together. Would that be something that is desirable?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned that in my written testimony as well. And to make a related point, there can be unintended consequences here if we don't design the program correctly. For example, the problem of palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia has been well documented. We want to make sure that not only do we have sound economic architecture here for such a program, but that it be environmentally sound, that it preserve biodiversity principles, et cetera. We're encountering some of those same issues here at home, and we need to just be aware that they should be part of our design for any international program.
Mr. Forrest?
I think there are ways that aid programs could be tremendously beneficial in helping with that local capacity building and helping to train the scientists and the local verifiers, et cetera, that about how to operate these types of projects. And as I think about it, in the business that I've been in over the last several years, a lot of us in the carbon business have benefited by work that USAID was doing in the late 1990s, out helping to do these kinds of training exercises on how carbon markets would work. So I've personally gone on missions to places, faraway places like Colombia and Ecuador, where I'll sit down with a group of people that have a spark of interest in this market, largely because of those programs that were in place back in the 90s that have sort of created an interest in getting involved in the market. And I particularly remember in those two countries going in, this is 2 or 3 years ago, and probably 2 out of 3 of the project proposals that someone brought forward were forestry projects, which we couldn't buy because we couldn't resell them in Europe. And so it really is, it's a great thing to create that capacity, but it really only works, as again, Ambassador Eisenstadt has set forth, if there's a clear policy signal that these credits are going to be good somewhere, therefore go forth and multiply. And I really do hope that the legislation here has an openness to those kind of things, because I think it can stimulate a huge amount of activity globally.
Last 2 questions. Dr. Gurney, if I gave you a magic wand and you could move the science forward, what would it take? Give me some sense of magnitude, what it would take for greater ability to be able to quantify the values here? I know that's very unscientific, but I want to throw you out of the box for a moment and see if I can take.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd go back. The thing that is probably the most effective place to expend resources at this point is, again, probably in-country capacity. By that I mean inter-country exchanges of scientific knowledge. I mean, the tropical forested countries are in some ways relatively unknown in terms of biomass content, spatial variability. There has been work in the last few years that more and more is going into tropical forest countries from the industrial scientific community, but we need partners in country. That has probably been one of the biggest barriers to doing effective work there. Consistency, of course, a lot of this goes back to things like governance, which I'm not an expert at, but I can certainly, as an observer from the outside, recognize that that's often a difficulty. I'll give you a quick anecdote. One of the problems we've had in doing work in some tropical countries is just simply getting instruments in country. Bringing them across the border effectively becomes an enormous barrier sometimes and a big slowdown. So the first thing I would do is probably build up in-country capacity, scientific exchange, development of infrastructure within countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, places where tropical deforestation is moving forward at a rapid pace. Install more monitoring and measurement equipment, the ability to fly aircraft over countries. As I said, satellite remote sensing technology is moving forward because it is mainly pushed by the industrial world, although we need in-country capacity to be able to use and analyze that satellite information.
Fine. That is very helpful. Finally, because I have a vote going on and we have to get to the floor, but I want to ask this: you've all referred to commodity prices. Certainly, there has been in recent months reports of soaring food prices worldwide, and many place the blame on biofuel mandates. Some have said that biofuel demand has been blamed for increased rates of deforestation in Indonesia and Brazil. And some actually say that this is actually, that some studies have concluded that even incredibly efficient biofuels such as ethanol from sugarcane could actually be worse for global warming because of the emissions growth associated with deforestation. Is this a cause for concern, something to look at? Is it a time for a pause, or do we just let this ride?
It's an excellent question. First of all, on the magic wand, my magic wand would be to get 60 votes for Lieberman Warner with forestry credits. Ag conversion is one of the key drivers of deforestation, and as I've mentioned, with rising commodity prices, there's increasing pressure to convert land. On the biofuels mandate that's in both US and EU legislation, it does put additional pressure on prices. It's estimated that about 15 to 20% of rising food prices come for this, and therefore increased pressure for conversion of tropical forests for ag production. This is, again, another reason, however, to place the value on the carbon stored in tropical forests, so there's a counterweight against the economic forces of rising ag commodity prices. On biofuels policy, it should include full carbon accounting, taking account of the carbon emissions associated with land conversion. The Renewable Fuel Standard, which is part of the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act, does require the administrator to take into account carbon emissions associated with land use and the production of biofuels to determine whether specific biofuels meet the emission reduction thresholds. I think this is important so that we have a real picture of what actually is being produced in terms of emission reductions or indeed increases by our biofuels mandate. So I think Congress has taken that step, and we need to get those results as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you all for your testimony today. I think it's a great opening to what will be a series of hearings that the committee and the subcommittee will be holding on a post-2012 climate change treaty and the things that we need to consider, particularly in this case, tropical forests. The record will remain open for 2 days so that committee members may submit additional questions to the witnesses. Certainly, if you receive those, we'd ask you to respond expeditiously to them. We thank you again for your insights and the consent to be included in the record.